It was with a curious blend of indignation and glee that Miss Maud Elphinstone discovered the body of Mr. Cyril Bletchley, late of Bletchley and Dodd, publishers of Mayfair, sprawled face down across the writing desk of his weekend cottage in Mimblesham-on-Wye, a sleepy riverside hamlet whose most sensational event hitherto had been the vicar's misprint of hymnals as hymens in last year's Harvest Festival programme. Mr. Bletchley, an editor of such famously sharp discernment that he once rejected 3 future Nobel laureates in a single afternoon, now lay quite motionless, his left hand grasping a fountain pen and his face inconveniently smothered in a galley-proof marked "Final Draft." One could not, Miss Elphinstone later noted with a sniff, have scripted a more theatrical exit had one hired a playwright. Lord Peter Wimsey was in the area entirely by accident, or as he put it, by the misdirection of an infernal Morris that fancies itself a Bentley when one turns left. He had intended a fishing holiday, but found himself instead digesting a tepid cream tea at the Fox and Feather and engaging in a quiet argument with the innkeeper over whether Horace or Juvenal better captured the English damp. It was there that the news reached him, carried by a breathless paper-boy who interrupted the debate with all the subtlety of a brass band. "Dead in his own ink," murmured Wimsey as the boy babbled, turning the phrase as if tasting it. Poor chap. Always feared an editorial mistake would be the end of him, didn't expect it to be his own. He excused himself from the table with a quote about Cicero's views on untimely demises, which went entirely unappreciated by the innkeeper, and ambled towards the crime scene, humming Greensleeves and examining the hedgerows as if they might produce a motive or at least a decent blackberry. The cottage, named the Proof House, stood genteelly aloof from the road, with ivy in all the usual places and shutters painted the faintly apologetic green of a retired bureaucrat. Inside, the scene was pleasingly untidy. Mr. Bletchley's body had been discovered by Miss Elphinstone, a neighbour of uncertain profession and definite opinions, who insisted she had called upon him to borrow sugar, though later admitted she'd hoped for a peek at his unpublished memoir, which was rumoured to contain unflattering sketches of several prominent literary women, including, it was said, herself. Wimsey entered the study and immediately began rearranging the room with his eyes. "A little too neat," he remarked. "For not the murder, of course, that's quite exuberant, but the staging. One does not die mid-annotation with such tidiness unless one is consciously composing an exit." He tapped the open window, noted the lack of disturbed dust on the sill, and asked whether Mr. Bletchley had kept a cat. "No?" he said brightly. "Then we shall have to blame the wind for misplacing the curtain tie, but I suspect the wind had help." The local constable, Sergeant Wodge, a man whose moustache conveyed far more authority than his conversation, offered the theory of natural causes. A stroke, perhaps. "Say, was rather red in the face when we turned him over," Wodge said hopefully. "Yes," said Wimsey, crouching to sniff a half-drunk tumbler of whiskey with the air of a disappointed connoisseur. "But so would you be, if your final tipple contained a suspicious whiff of bitter almonds. Unless, of course, Bletchley had taken up exotic cocktails in his dotage. Cyanide and soda, perhaps." Wimsey's observations prompted little more than blank stares from the small assembly. He did not mind. The less one explained, the more interesting people became in their responses. He turned next to the manuscript lying beneath the corpse's left elbow, noting that the ink had smeared, but only in one direction. "Left-handed?" he asked aloud, though more to himself. "Curious. I had him down as a righty, strictly in terms of handwriting, of course." The constable shifted uneasily. "We've taken statements from Miss Elphinstone and the cleaner, Mrs. Flagg. Both say they didn't touch nothing." "Splendid," Wimsey said. "Then we must assume the murderer was kind enough to leave us a tidy tableau. I do love considerate. Criminals, they're so much easier to correct." He reached into his coat, retrieved a pair of pince-nez, more for effect than necessity, and surveyed the room again. A clock chimed in the hall. Wimsey tilted his head. 13 minutes. Past the hour, he said. And yet our friend Bletchley noted 12 minutes past on his final line. Either he had foresight beyond the grave, or... He paused, smiling faintly. The killer was no better at timekeeping than he was at grammar. The constable looked blank. Miss Elphinstone snorted. And so, the death of Cyril Bletchley, editor, memoirist, occasional scandalmonger, was entered into the parish records as sudden, suspicious, and entirely inconvenient. Wimsey requested a bath drawn at the Fox and Feather, a strong cup of lapsang, and asked someone to send for his man Bunter, lest the locals mistake my idle speculation for actual effort. And to no one in particular, as he wandered off down the gravel path, he said, "It's always the footnotes that kill you." By the following morning, Lord Peter Wimsey had established headquarters in the parlour of the Fox and Feather, where he'd requisitioned a writing desk, 2 pots of ink, one inferior, which he insisted on calling ghastly mauve, and a large map of Mimblesham-on-Wye hastily produced by the innkeeper's wife from a commemorative tea towel. Bunter arrived precisely at 9:15, bringing with him a suitcase, a camera, and an expression that managed to suggest both disapproval of the rural air and tolerance of his employer's whims. "You'll want the enlarger later, my lord?" he inquired as Wimsey was peering over his spectacles at the schedule of trains to and from Paddington. "Almost certainly," Wimsey murmured, tapping a penciled note next to the 5:42, "especially if our corpse was still alive when the 4:10 rolled past." By 10 o'clock, Sergeant Wadge had rounded up the first 2 witnesses for interview. They were seated stiffly on the edge of their chairs, eyeing Wimsey as one might a slightly erratic bishop. Mrs. Flagg, the housekeeper, was a monument of sour respectability whose apron was ironed with military precision. Her husband, Alfred Flagg, had been employed as gardener and general man-of-all duties by Mr. Bletchley, and seemed to wilt beside her like a plant grown in too much shadow. "Mr. Bletchley weren't no trouble," said Mrs. Flagg stoutly. "Odd hours, yes, and he didn't like fish on Fridays, which I always thought peculiar for a gentleman of letters, but quiet like otherwise. Read a great deal and didn't mind what went on in the village, so long as the front step was swept." "Did he receive visitors?" Wimsey asked, leaning back, fingers steepled. "Literary lions, scheming authors, vengeful memoirists." Mrs. Flagg pursed her lips. "There was a Miss Collingwood up last week, stayed 2 nights. She said she was working on a book about Mr. Bletchley's methods. Seemed very familiar. If you follow me." "I do," said Wimsey solemnly, "though I must confess I rarely enjoy the trip." "Then on Sunday," added Mr. Flagg, encouraged by Wimsey's tone, "there was a man. Tall, thin chap. Wore gloves even indoors. Looked like he'd swallowed a lemon but paid his cab fare in half-crowns, so I didn't say nothing. He came just after tea and left before supper." "Name?" asked Wimsey. "Didn't give one. But I remember he asked if the clock in the Boer study was fast. Funny thing to ask." Wimsey jotted a note and made a faint in the key of suspicion. "And you, Mrs. Flagg, did you notice anything odd when you came in yesterday morning?" The woman frowned. "Kitchen window was unlatched. I'd swear I bolted it Monday evening, but there was no sign of forced entry and nothing taken, and the sugar bowl was half empty. Mr. Bletchley never touched sugar, said it dulled the palate." "Perhaps a ghost with a sweet tooth," Wimsey suggested. Mrs. Flagg gave him a look that would have soured fresh milk. Next came Miss Maud Elphinstone, swathed in scarves of uncertain colour and trinkets shaped like serpents and scarabs. She insisted on calling Wimsey "darling boy," and took to the role of witness with theatrical flair. "I found him with his head in the proofs as if he were consumed by his own edits," she said, eyes shining. "Tragic. He always said words would be the death of him. I didn't scream, you know. I never scream. I have nerves of steel, unlike that vile woman at the grocer's who fainted over a bat once." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "And you visited?" "The deceased for sugar. I always bring my own," she said, wounded. "I went to see if he might lend me a Latin dictionary. My own was tragically lost in the great roof leak of 1934. "And did he give you one?" "No, he was already stiff." Wimsey coughed delicately into his hand. "And was the window open when you entered?" "It was. I noticed at once because the curtain flapped like a mourning banner." "Did you move anything? Touch anything?" "Moved myself away from the body, darling boy. That was quite enough excitement for one day." "Indeed. And what did you think of Mr. Bletchley personally?" she sniffed. "Opinionated, unforgiving. Told me my verse had the metre of a one-legged horse and suggested I take up knitting. But he had lovely handwriting." Wimsey offered her a peppermint and escorted her out. By lunchtime, Bunter had developed the photograph of the study, and laid it out beside Wimsey's notes. "Observe, Bunter," Wimsey said, tapping the image. "The whiskey glass, moved after. Death, the blotter too clean, and the man himself too obligingly positioned. One almost expects a stage curtain to fall. Dramatic staging, my lord? Either that or the murderer was a novelist, which, given the company our victim kept, is hardly narrowing the field." Wimsey leaned back in his chair, examining. "The list of visitors. A jealous poetess, a gloved stranger, an open window, and a dead man who wasn't fond of sugar. I think it's time we found out what exactly was in that final draft, and who didn't want it read." The manuscript in question, A Life in Letters and Margins, was a thick sheaf of closely typed pages bound with a blue ribbon, slightly crumpled on the top left corner, where one presumed Mr. Bletchley's final encounter with gravity had occurred. It was Bunter who retrieved it from the coroner's evidence bag, with all the reverence due to a holy relic. Wimsey flipped through the pages with the air of a man both amused and bored, pausing occasionally to mark a passage with his silver pencil. The content, it seemed, was Bletchley's own memoir, a collection of editorial anecdotes, stinging literary, criticisms and veiled threats, barely obscured by legal euphemisms. There were whole sections devoted to his grievances with the publishing industry, including a particularly acidic chapter entitled The Vanity of Poets and Other Fauna. One name appeared repeatedly in those chapters, always with an undercurrent of disdain. Basil Trench, as it turned out, was a known quantity. A once promising playwright turned tabloid reviewer, he had built a minor career on caustic theatre columns and dramatic public feuds, most notably a quarrel with Bletchley following the rejection of his autobiography, Truths the Theatre Never Told. The incident had been minor in public, but catastrophic in pride. Bletchley's rejection letter, according to village rumour, included the phrase, "Your manuscript possesses all the qualities of genius save talent." Trench had reportedly never forgiven the insult. Wimsey, intrigued, wired his London solicitor with a request for Trench's last known address and spent the afternoon wandering the lanes of Mimblesham, ostensibly inspecting birdsong, but actually timing footpaths, calculating line of sight to the cottage and measuring the church bell's reach by ear. "Murder," he remarked to Bunter as they passed a yew tree older than the Church of England, "requires so much fuss. If people were only content to loathe each other quietly." Bunter made no comment, but later handed Wimsey a brown envelope, containing a clipping from the Evening Observer, dated 2 weeks prior. "Trench declares Bletchley a coward, he fears what I know." The article detailed Trench's latest theatrical review, but concluded with a barbed aside regarding Bletchley's upcoming memoir, accusing him of peddling half-truths to please the literati and silence the past. Trench had, it seemed, accused Bletchley of omitting certain indiscretions involving a young actress who had vanished from the scene some years earlier. The implication was scandalous, but vague. "Not a threat, exactly," said Wimsey, "but certainly a stake in the game. Jealousy, wounded pride, and perhaps a secret worth killing for. It has all the flavour of a stage villain's monologue, but I wonder whether Mr. Trench prefers action to soliloquy." That same evening, Wimsey arranged a call with Inspector Croom from the Metropolitan Police, who confirmed that Trench had recently taken a taxi from Charing Cross to Mimblesham and back on Sunday afternoon. The cabby remembered him clearly. Gloves, sour expression tipped in coppers. The return journey had taken place just after sunset. Trench, according to the inspector, had no alibi for the interim hours except for a claim of walking and thinking, a practice that, Wimsey observed, seldom left cyanide in one's jacket pocket. When summoned the next morning, Trench arrived in a coat 2 sizes too dramatic for the village. He carried a cane tipped with silver and looked as though he expected to be accused of either seduction or espionage. His moustache bristled with defiance. "You believe I killed him?" Trench said the moment he was shown into the parlour. "My dear fellow," Wimsey replied cheerfully, "I believe all sorts of things before breakfast, but do go on." Trench narrowed his eyes. "I visited him. Yes, we had words, predictably unpleasant. He refused to remove certain content from his memoir, claimed it was within his rights to describe the past as he saw fit. I told him he was playing with fire. He said he'd enjoy the warmth. Did you threaten him? Certainly not. I reminded him forcefully that not all skeletons enjoy public exhibition. Wimsey nodded. Was he afraid of you? Trench looked genuinely amused. Bletchley feared no one. He was arrogant enough to think himself invulnerable, but he underestimated the damage a memory can do. You left around 6. Yes, I took the bus into Y and then caught the train home. Not the cab. Trench hesitated. I walked halfway, changed my mind, and hailed a car. Why? No reason. Only it's a curious man who walks with a suitcase and gloves through the Mimblesham lanes at twilight and finds it restful. Trench did not reply. As he left, Wimsey watched the back of his head with idle speculation. He has the temperament, he said to Bunter, but lacks the timing. If he killed Bletchley, he did so with unusual subtlety for a man who once slapped a producer with a playbill during a live broadcast. That afternoon, Bunter handed Wimsey a list of household keys. Obtained from Mrs. Flagg, my lord. She keeps a ledger. No duplicate keys unaccounted for except one marked study spare, which she claims went missing 2 months ago. 2 months, Wimsey echoed. Enough time for someone to borrow, copy, and return it. Or more simply, to keep it and let the dust settle. Mrs. Flagg believed Mr. Bletchley misplaced it, Bunter added. Mrs. Flagg believes the decimal system encourages moral decay. I doubt she would consider theft more than temporary disorder. Wimsey spent the evening rereading Bletchley's memoir, sipping brandy, and making the occasional snort of amusement. He lingered longest on Chapter 9, in which Bletchley described a man of brittle brilliance whose words conceal a cowardice he dare not confess. The initials matched Basil Trench, and the anecdote, a duel of sorts involving a playwright, an actress and a failed suicide, carried the unmistakable stench of something personal. Would you kill to hide a humiliation, Bunter? He asked, not entirely rhetorically. I should prefer to bribe the editor, my lord. Quite right. Much less fuss. By the time the fire died down, Wimsey had filled 3 pages of a notebook with seemingly unrelated scribbles, train times, ink smudges, a recipe for cucumber sandwiches, and a sketch of a brass key. The final line simply read, "Why the window if the door was unlocked?" Bunter cleared the tray and said nothing, but Wimsey's eyes remained on the flames. Somewhere, behind the genteel facades of literary ego and mild scandal, something darker had crept in, quiet, deliberate, and efficient. The poison had been simple, the motive was not, and the final draft, Wimsey suspected, was not quite as final as it claimed. It was mid-morning on a Wednesday of impeccable stillness, so still, in fact, that one could hear the milk float from 3 streets away, as if time itself had decided to deliver in glass bottles, when Lord Peter Wimsey announced that he would like to discuss curtains. Sergeant Wodge, who had just managed to tie his notebook shut with string, and was inwardly congratulating himself on a morning without incident, nearly choked on his tepid tea. "Curtains?" he echoed, blinking. "Yes," said Wimsey, standing, in the middle of Mr. Bletchley's study, with the expression of a man admiring a particularly confusing statue. "Specifically the curtains in this room. Damask, if I'm not mistaken, though I confess the shade is disappointingly ecclesiastical. Mauve again, Bunter. This village must be under some aesthetic curse." Bunter, who had already reached for his notebook, merely nodded. "The pattern appears to be standard Jacobean scrollwork, my lord, common in reproduction sets sold by Whitaker and Sons." "Excellent," said Wimsey. "Then we may safely deduce that Mr. Bletchley, or someone on his behalf, was more interested in appearance than originality." "That tells us something," Sergeant Wodge coughed. "With respect, Lord Wimsey, I fail to see how curtains help us catch a killer." "My dear fellow," said Wimsey, brushing dust from his sleeve with exaggerated care. "In murder, as in millinery, it is the detail that unmasks the rogue." He turned and pointed to the curtain rod, which sagged slightly to the right. "Observe, the curtain hangs unevenly, not dramatically, just enough to suggest it was tugged. And if you'll kindly indulge me, note the skirting just below, scuffed and recently at that. You think someone stood there?" "I think," said Wimsey, stepping back, "that someone hid there." The idea, once spoken aloud, felt absurd. The curtain, though voluminous, was hardly grand theatre drapery. Yet the depth behind it was just enough for a slight man or a woman to tuck themselves in out of sight, and perhaps overhear something not intended for them. And why, he continued, now pacing lightly, would someone hide behind a curtain unless they were in the house without permission, or overhearing a conversation too delicate to be witnessed? Either way, it introduces a player we haven't accounted for. Bunter cleared his throat. The curtain's edge, my lord. There is a faint residue of boot polish, the wax type, not common in domestic households, more likely military or theatrical. Whimsy beamed. You see, Wodge, Bunter's taste in floor grime has once again outstripped Scotland Yard's finest. Sergeant Wodge muttered something about ghost stories. Leaving the constable to inspect the curtain with faint dismay, Whimsy wandered through the rest of the house like an academic in a second-hand bookshop. He paused before a grandfather clock that had not chimed since before the armistice and began fiddling with its hands. Time, he said to Bunter, is the great liar in all crimes. It pretends to be fixed, but it is always subject to interpretation. Clocks are opinionated creatures, aren't they? He opened the clock face, revealing the mechanism. It was set wrong by 13 minutes. Mrs. Flagg said she wound it Monday morning as usual, and yet our victim's last notation said 12 past, but the constable's pocket watch, and my own, say 13 past the hour. What do you make of that? That he wrote the note a minute earlier, suggested Wodge unhelpfully. Or that someone altered the clock after the note was written, Whimsy countered. A minute's difference is irrelevant to the dead, but rather helpful to the living, especially if one is constructing an alibi. He turned abruptly toward the small writing desk by the window. And now curtains, clocks and carpets, what next? Ah yes, the carpet. Bunter had already unrolled a section near the hearth. A faint indentation was visible, circular, metallic. Tripod. Leg, he offered. Too small for a camera, too large for a walking stick. Possibly a dictaphone. Bletchley recorded his memoirs before typing them, if I recall from his publisher's notes. Which means, Whimsy said slowly, that there may be a recording of his final hours. Wodge turned pale. You think he recorded the moment of his death? Not intentionally, but I rather think murderers are not always thorough, particularly when they believe themselves alone. Later that afternoon, Bunter produced a parcel from the constabulary's lost and found, a portable dictaphone case, found tucked under a pile of galley proofs by the cleaner. It was missing a spool. Convenient, said Whimsy, though perhaps not irreversible. He placed the machine on the table and began testing it. The device was an older model, clunky but robust, and after some fiddling with the internal mechanisms, Bunter discovered that a section of audio tape had been wound into the second chamber, a backup reel of sorts. It would require cleaning, but it was there, I wonder, Whimsy mused aloud, whether Mr. Trench knew this existed. Unlikely, said Bunter. He left no sign of searching the study, nor did he mention recordings in his statement. Indeed. And he is the sort of man who would have mentioned it simply to imply that he hadn't tampered with it. They set the tape aside for cleaning, and Whimsy returned to his notes. 3 names had risen now to the top of his list. Basil Trench, the obvious suspect with motive and opportunity, yet perhaps too eager, too visible. Miss Collingwood, the researcher with peculiar familiarity and undisclosed intentions, who had not been seen since Wednesday last. And, disturbingly, a third figure, known only by implication, the person behind the curtain, the one whose presence no one mentioned, but whom the evidence refused to ignore. That evening, as the sky turned the same shade as the curtains and a drizzle dusted the hedgerows, Whimsy sat in the lounge with a cup of Darjeeling and reread chapter 12 of Bletchley's memoir. It was a peculiar chapter, not scandalous in content nor particularly literary in style, but rather an unexpected philosophical ramble on the nature of erasure. Bletchley had written about forgetting, deliberately and otherwise. He spoke of secrets lost in time, of guilt turned into fable, and of people who live as if their pasts have been conveniently rewritten. There were no names, no direct accusations, but something in the tone was cold and watchful. Whimsy tapped the page thoughtfully. He knew something, or suspected, and someone knew that he was hinting at it. He turned to Bunter. "We must speak with Miss Collingwood again." "She has not returned to the village, my lord," Bunter replied. "And her London address appears to be a rented postbox under a false name." Wimsey smiled faintly. The plot stiffens, like overcooked pudding." He stood, stretching. "Tomorrow we interview the publisher and perhaps the vicar. There is always a vicar in these things. They're terribly useful for overheard confessions." And as Bunter extinguished the lamps and set the latch on the door, Wimsey jotted a final note in the margin of his notebook. Curtain moved. Clock wrong. Tape missing. Manuscript unfinished. And someone, perhaps the least expected, was listening the whole time. It was a crisp Thursday when Lord Peter Wimsey paid an unscheduled call upon Mr. Reginald Dodd, the surviving half of Bletchley and Dodd, publishers. The firm's office, modestly tucked above a tobacconist in Bayswater, exhaled the heavy scent of newsprint, dust, and very old linoleum. Dodd, a narrow man with watery eyes and a moustache that drooped like wet punctuation, received Wimsey with the trepidation of one who has just remembered a forgotten invoice. "Lord Wimsey," he said, standing awkwardly, "I didn't realize you were taking an interest." "Interest?" Wimsey repeated, lowering himself into a cracked leather armchair. "Good heavens, no. If I took interest, I'd have to commit. I merely enjoy other people's crimes vicariously, of course, though I dare say Mr. Bletchley's final chapter is proving more compelling than anything he ever printed." Dodd blinked. "You think it was murder?" Wimsey adjusted his cufflinks. "I think it was deliberate, and that someone, somewhere, is desperately hoping we accept the simple narrative." He placed a folded sheet of paper on the desk. "This," he said, "is Mr. Bletchley's handwritten corrections for the last proof, dated Monday evening, 12 minutes past 9, yet the clock in the study, wound only that morning, read 13 past when the body was found. Curious, no?" Dodd looked helpless. "It's only a minute." "Exactly," said Wimsey. "And it's the sort of detail that only matters to people like Bletchley, or murderers." He leaned forward. "Tell me, Mr. Dodd, who stood to gain if that manuscript were never published?" Dodd looked suddenly very tired. "Everyone, Lord Wimsey. Cyril didn't write memoirs, he wrote vendettas. That book was a time bomb. Half our backlist would have walked if they saw what he'd written about them. Miss Collingwood was the only one who could calm him down, and even she gave up trying. I tried to convince him to redact a few names." "Did he?" "No. He said, 'Truth is truth, Reginald, and if it gets me sued, I shall at least be famous posthumously.'" "Rather an inflexible corpse," said Wimsey with a grimace. "And what of Miss Collingwood? I hear she was researching him, fond of him." "I thought so," said Dodd. "She arrived a few months ago, said she was writing a biography and wanted to shadow him. At first he was flattered. Then he grew suspicious. Said she asked too many questions about the early days, whatever that meant. The day she left the village, he told me he was cutting her from the acknowledgements entirely." Wimsey sat back. "Fascinating. She appears to have vanished quite completely, which makes me think we ought to take her more seriously." Dodd hesitated. "There's one thing." "Yes?" Cyril mentioned in a letter that Miss Collingwood had found something, some document perhaps, linked to an old scandal. He didn't specify what, but he said, and I quote, "The girl has claws, Reginald, and she knows where I buried the bones." Wimsey lifted an eyebrow. "Metaphor, one hopes." I didn't press. Outside, Bunter waited beside a parked cab. As Wimsey climbed in, he produced a folded telegram. "From the vicar, my lord. He says he's remembered something." "Clergy always remember at the appropriate moment," said Wimsey. "Like Chekhov's revolver in Act 1. They arrived at the vicarage to find Reverend Timms in a state of mild fluster, waving a letter in one hand and a biscuit in the other. Lord Wimsey, yes, I thought I should mention. This was posted through the church letterbox late Monday night. I assumed it was a donation or perhaps an unsigned complaint, but it appears to be a note. Odd phrasing. I only opened it yesterday." Wimsey accepted the envelope. The handwriting was hurried, the paper thin. He read it silently once, then again. "They know if anything happens, ask the girl. She's not who she says. I'm being watched. Window open, not by accident. Burn this. CB. Cryptic." said Whimsy. "And unsigned, you see," Timms offered, "except it's signed C.B. Cyril Bletchley." He had a habit of initialing his most melodramatic remarks, usually in margin notes. Back at the Fox and Feather, Whimsy reviewed his notes by firelight. The dictaphone tape, now cleaned and repaired by Bunter, was finally ready. They threaded it onto the player, and a faint hiss filled the room. Then came Bletchley's voice, nasal and brisk. Chapter 12. Memory is a thief in tailored gloves. We choose what to forget, what to forgive. But there are always witnesses, always shadows, who remember differently. This is not for the book, this is for me. And perhaps for you, Collingwood, if you're listening. There was a pause. Shuffling paper. You asked me about 1923, you asked the wrong questions. It wasn't just the review, it was the retreat. The girl, she disappeared because someone wanted her gone. I wanted the truth, but the truth was dangerous. I let it go. Another pause, a creak, perhaps a chair. Then someone was in the room. I saw the curtain move. Wait. The recording ended. Bunter, ever unflappable, looked at Whimsy. He knew. "Yes," said Whimsy quietly. He knew someone was watching him, and it wasn't Trench. Trench was in the front parlour. The curtain is by the window, facing the garden. They stared at the fire for a long time. The timeline was becoming clear. Monday evening, Bletchley wrote his final corrections at 9:12. He saw movement, behind the curtain, or perhaps reflected in the glass. Someone had entered quietly. The front door was unlocked. The study was at the back. He suspected, but did not raise the alarm. He kept recording, and sometime shortly after that he died. Poison in the whiskey. The glass wiped once. The decanter smudged, but not thoroughly. And the dictaphone, left running, then taken. Except, not completely. The second reel had been forgotten or unnoticed. "Sloppy," said Whimsy, rising. "Not the work of a professional killer, someone with nerves." He returned to his notebook. The timeline now read 8:55 p.m. Curtain disturbed. Tweet 12 p.m. Final notation, written shortly after. Movement heard. Voice stops B5. 5 p.m. Miss Elphinstone claims to have discovered the body, but doesn't call for help until 10:15. "Too much," Whimsy murmured. "She claims to have found the body cold, but rigor wouldn't have set in so quickly, not unless he'd died much earlier, which he didn't. That gives her time. And motive? Perhaps?" Bunter looked up. "Miss Elphinstone? She claimed to come for sugar, but she brought her own. She claimed to loathe Bletchley, but she knew about the manuscript. She claims to have found him, but didn't call the police at once. Instead, she waited." "Could she have returned later?" Bunter asked. Whimsy nodded slowly. "Easily. She lives next door, knows the habits, knew when the Flagg household was asleep." Bunter hesitated. "And the poison?" "She's a writer, or says she is. But she owns dozens of old pharmacopoeias, herbalism, arsenic for gout, cyanide for pests, all available if one knows what to extract." Whimsy scribbled one final line under the timeline. "Murderer enters not by force, but by habit, and leaves, through a window open long before the crime." Then he looked up, eyes sharp with sudden clarity. "Tomorrow, Bunter, we visit Miss Elphinstone again, and this time we'll ask about 1923. Miss Maud Elphinstone greeted Lord Peter Whimsy with the sort of smile generally reserved for solicitors delivering bad news to wealthy widows. Draped in a paisley shawl and brandishing a teacup as if it were a ceremonial object, she gestured toward her overstuffed drawing-room armchairs with theatrical ease. The air was thick with lavender and the distinct bitterness of burnt toast, and somewhere behind the curtain, a canary trilled defiantly. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Lord Whimsy?" she said, lowering herself into a velvet chair that creaked with disapproval. "Oh, idle curiosity, Miss Elphinstone," Whimsy replied cheerfully, removing his gloves finger by finger with the gravitas of a man disarming a trap. "I've been thinking about sugar." She blinked. "Sugar?" "Yes. You said you came to Mr. Bletchley's cottage that night to borrow some, yet also claimed to always bring your own. I confess I find this contradiction as intriguing as your choice of approach. May I ask, are those Egyptian scarabs or merely Cambridge Union replicas?" "They're authentic," she sniffed, And you have a suspicious mind. It's been accused of worse, said Whimsy, but it does tend to stir when presented with convenient testimony. You see, the more I consider that evening, the more it appears too rehearsed. The sugar, the timing, the casual discovery of the body, one might believe you were setting a stage. Miss Elphinstone's expression flickered, only slightly like a candle guttering against a draught, but Bunter, ever watchful, noted the way her fingers tightened against the cup's handle. I found the man dead, she said firmly. Do. You question that? I question everything, said Whimsy, crossing one leg over the other, including why a woman with no affection for Mr. Bletchley, no active manuscript and no declared profession would concern herself with his memoirs, unless, of course, she had once featured in them. Silence hung between them, then she laughed, a short, dry rasp. He never used my real name. No, but he described you, the poetess with lyrical delusions and a taste for metaphors sharper than her morals. Quite the tribute, her face tightened. He destroyed my reputation, did he? Or merely resurrected what others had forgotten? Whimsy tilted his head. You see, Miss Elphinstone, if that is your name, there's a gap in the record. Before 1930, you disappear. No publications, no public readings, no trace. And yet in 1923 there was a young woman named Isabel Croft, bright, brilliant, destined for literary renown. Then she vanished. The gossip columns said heartbreak, scandal, even an abortion, but I suspect the truth was rather more complex. She was silent now. Her eyes, flinty and glittering, held his without blinking. I think, said Whimsy softly, that you were Isabel Croft, that you had an affair with someone powerful, perhaps an editor, perhaps Bletchley himself. I think it ended badly. And I think years later, you returned as Maud Elphinstone to live quietly beside the man who destroyed you, perhaps to watch, perhaps to ensure he never told the whole truth. You presume a great deal. I deduce, said Whimsy, and I'm not the only one. Bletchley suspected you. He left a note, cryptic, yes, but addressed to someone who is not who she says. He also left a recording. You were in the room when he died, weren't you? Her voice, when it came, was low. I didn't kill him. But you were there. Yes. She stood, moving to the window, arms wrapped tightly around herself. I went to confront him. I'd read what he planned to publish. The chapter about the girl in the red dress, that was me. It was vicious, vile. He had no right to dredge it up. I begged him to remove it. He refused. So you threatened him? No, she said. He laughed at me. Said if I tried to sue, he'd expose me entirely. Said I was already a footnote in his legend, so I left. Furious. You left through the front? No. Her voice was barely audible. Through the garden. I didn't want to be seen. I thought it would be over. But I went back later, around 9. I couldn't sleep. I wanted to plead again. The light was on. I stepped inside, and he was already slumped over the desk. Poisoned, Whimsy said gently. Yes, the room was quiet. Nothing disturbed except the curtain. I had moved. I thought it was a breeze. I didn't think to check. Whimsy exchanged a look with Bunter. You didn't call the police. I panicked, she snapped. Can you imagine what they would have said? A woman with no alibi using a false name, standing over the body of a man who'd once ruined her. I waited. I tried to compose myself. I left. Then I returned later and pretended to find him. Whimsy nodded. That much, I believe. You think I'm lying about the rest. I think you're lying about seeing nothing, because someone was in the room, behind that curtain, someone who had reason to silence Bletchley before his memoirs reached print. She looked stricken. Who? That, said Whimsy, rising, is what I intend to find out. But if you wish to clear yourself entirely, I'll need the truth about 1923, all of it. She hesitated. Then slowly she reached into a drawer and produced a folded envelope, old, worn, and brittle. This, she said, is the letter he sent me after it all ended. He blamed me for ruining his chances, said I was a distraction, that he'd ensured no publisher would touch me. I kept it as a reminder. Whimsy took it carefully. The ink was faded, but legible. The language, harsh, vindictive, unmistakably Bletchley. It confirmed everything. The affair, the fallout, the calculated professional sabotage. "This," said Whimsy, "may not solve the murder, but it tells me who Bletchley feared exposing, and who might fear being exposed." He paused at the E. "Miss Croft Elphinstone, whoever you choose to be tomorrow, you've lied, but you haven't killed. Let's hope the same can't be said for the others." Back at the inn, Whimsy laid out the facts once again. The timeline, the tape, the poisoned whiskey, the open curtain, the missing spool. But now there was a new thread, a buried identity, a scandal long past, and a victim whose final work threatened. To disinter more than old grudges, Bletchley had enemies. Trench, Miss Collingwood, even Elphinstone, but only one of them had access, motive, and the presence of mind to manipulate the scene. He turned to Bunter. "We need to find Miss Collingwood. And quickly. She may hold the last page in this chapter, or perhaps she's the author of the ending." The search for Miss Collingwood began as one might expect, with a flurry of polite inquiries, a few half-hearted telephone calls, and a gathering of increasingly anxious local officials who seemed to think that a missing literary researcher was somewhere between an amusing inconvenience and a mild scandal. For Lord Peter Wimsey, however, the absence was not merely a curiosity, but a vital piece of the puzzle. It was on a rain-sodden Friday afternoon, with the sky awash of slate and the river swollen with the relentless drizzle, that Wimsey found himself once more at the Fox and Feather, examining a sheaf of correspondence procured from the village postmistress. Among them was a letter addressed to Mr. Cyril Bletchley, written in an elegant, almost imperious hand, one which he recognized immediately. "From Miss Collingwood, no doubt," he mused, unfolding the sheet carefully. The letter was brief, but packed with significance. "Dear Mr. Bletchley, I regret that circumstances have forced my departure earlier than planned. However, I trust you will find my preliminary research of some assistance. The truth, as you say, must be uncovered no matter the cost. I will contact you once settled. Until then, I urge discretion. Yours faithfully, E. Collingwood." The final sentence bore a faint smudge of ink, as if the writer had paused mid-thought, then reconsidered. Wimsey noted it with interest, filing the letter alongside the various scraps of manuscript and police reports. "What are you thinking, my lord?" Bunter inquired, having entered quietly. "That Miss Collingwood's exit was more than mere coincidence," Wimsey replied, folding the letter with care. "Her departure was calculated, and her promise of discretion, well, that suggests she feared discovery." The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Wodge, who arrived with news that a local tramp had been seen loitering near the vicarage late Wednesday night, the same night Miss Collingwood had disappeared. "Odd fellow, Lord Wimsey," Wodge said. "He claims he saw a woman carrying a parcel toward the river. Said she looked nervous, kept glancing over her shoulder." "Parcel, you say?" Wimsey asked, eyes alight. "Aye, wrapped in brown paper." "Interesting," said Wimsey. "Bunter, fetch my coat. We're going to take a walk by the river." The riverbank was muddy and tangled with brambles, the early spring wind tugging at Wimsey's overcoat as he picked his way carefully along the narrow path. Here the neat facades of Mimblesham gave way to wild undergrowth and the lingering scent of damp earth. As they neared a secluded bend, Bunter spotted a fragment of torn brown paper caught in the thorn bushes. Wimsey bent to retrieve it, part of a letter, water-damaged and barely legible. He read aloud, pausing over the faint ink. "The truth must be buried before it is revealed. Trust no one. The past is not dead." Bunter frowned. "Sounds like a warning." "More than a warning," Wimsey replied. "It's a threat, and from the handwriting I suspect it was written by our elusive Miss Collingwood herself. The discovery cast new light on the case. Miss Collingwood was no innocent researcher, but a woman entwined deeply in the secrets Bletchley had sought to expose." Returning to the inn, Wimsey and Bunter convened with Sergeant Wodge and the vicar. Reverend Timms, who had come bearing yet another piece of unexpected testimony. "I received a confession of sorts," Timms said hesitantly, "from Mr. Alfred Flagg, the gardener. He claims to have witnessed a heated exchange between Miss Collingwood and another visitor, a man in gloves, on the Monday evening before Mr. Bletchley's death." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. "Gloved man, you say? The same description as our mysterious visitor noted by the Flaggs?" Timms nodded. "Yes. He said the woman was pleading, and the man refused to relent. The argument ended with the woman storming off in tears." Do we know the identity of this man?" Wimsey asked. "Only that he was tall, thin, and spoke with a clipped accent, a stranger to the village." Wimsey took a moment, then said, "This stranger must be the one who moved the curtain, and possibly the missing spool from the dictaphone. He may have had as much to lose from Bletchley's memoir as Miss Collingwood." He paused, considering the implications. "We must find this man." Wodge shook his head. "No leads, I'm afraid. None knew his name or where he came from." "Not even the cab driver who took him to and from the station. The cabby only remembers the gloves and the sour look." Wimsey sighed. "A man who wishes to remain unseen is often the hardest to track. But every man makes mistakes, and every mistake leaves a trace." He turned to Bunter. "We need to inspect the cab company's records, see if the stranger's journey left any paper trail." While the search for the gloved man continued, Wimsey returned to the study at the proof house. There he meticulously retraced the timeline of the evening, cross-referencing statements, railway timetables, and even the chimes of the church clock. He noted that the vicar's bells, audible from the cottage, rang 3 times at 9:15 p.m., a fact corroborated by several witnesses. Yet Mr. Bletchley's last notation was at 9:12 p.m., and the clock in his study read 9:13 p.m. when the body was discovered. "This," Wimsey said aloud, "suggests the murderer tampered with the clock to confuse the timeline, perhaps to establish an alibi." He then examined the footprints leading to and from the window. Most were faint, but one set was distinctive: a woman's shoe with a slight heel and a scuffed toe. The sole pattern matched none of the locals, but could perhaps be Miss Collingwood's or Miss Elphinstone's. Someone left by the window, Wimsey concluded, contradicting claims that the front door was the sole ingress and egress. Bunter pointed to the soot-stained hearth. "There are ashes from a burnt letter here, my lord." Wimsey examined the remnants carefully. "Indeed, someone attempted to destroy a written message, likely the note from Miss Collingwood." He carefully collected the ashes and took them back to the inn's firelighter, where Bunter began a painstaking process to retrieve faint ink traces. Hours later, the recovered text formed fragments of a warning, similar to the piece found by "The river. The past should remain buried. Danger. No trust," Wimsey read. "We are dealing with people desperate to silence the truth," he said grimly, "and willing to kill to keep it." As night fell, Wimsey sat before the fire, contemplating the web of deceit. He was certain now that the key to the mystery was not merely the identity of the murderer, but the secret that Bletchley had guarded fiercely, something so dangerous that it cast suspicion over half the village. He smiled faintly. A grand game, played behind the polite facades of Mimblesham. But all games have their final move. The final move, Wimsey mused, was approaching, and he intended to be waiting. The night was thick with fog as Lord Peter Wimsey prepared his unexpected performance, a reenactment of the final hours of Cyril Bletchley, to be staged in the very study where the editor had met his untimely end. Invitations were sent to the key players: Miss Elphinstone, Sergeant Wodge, Reverend Timms, and most notably Basil Trench, whose theatrical nature suggested he would not resist an opportunity to play a leading role, even in a tragedy. The local constabulary, less enthusiastic but resigned, took their places at the edges, notebooks at the ready. The guests assembled in the dimly lit room. The curtains, restored to their slightly uneven hang, swayed gently in the draught from the open window. Wimsey stood near the hearth, lighting a cigarette with deliberate care. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice low and precise, "tonight we shall attempt to answer the question, who killed Mr. Cyril Bletchley? But more importantly, how, when, and why?" He gestured to the furniture, each item arranged with meticulous fidelity to the night of the murder. This table where the final draft lay, the glass half full of whiskey, the open window, the moved curtain. "Let us proceed," he said. "First, the timing." He pointed to the grandfather clock. The clock was wound Monday morning and set incorrectly by 13 minutes, a seemingly trivial detail, but one which created confusion around the exact time of death. He paused, letting the significance settle. "Mr. Bletchley wrote his last note at 12 minutes past 9, a time we know because of the manuscript's timestamp. However, the clock read 13 minutes past when the body was found, and the church bells chimed 3 times at 9:15. This discrepancy was deliberately introduced to support an alibi. Whimsy's eyes swept the room. Now, observe the open window and the uneven curtain. The murderer needed an exit that would not be noticed, a path overlooked by those accustomed to the front door's use. The boot polish found on the curtain's hem belongs to a theatrical type, suggesting the presence of someone accustomed to disguise. He then moved to the dictaphone. The recording, partially destroyed but thankfully salvaged by Bunter, reveals Mr. Bletchley's awareness of being watched. He heard movement behind the curtain, but failed to identify the observer before his death. At this, Whimsy turned sharply to Basil Trench, who sat rigid, a forced smile masking impatience. "Mr. Trench, your sudden arrival in Mimblesham, your refusal to provide a solid alibi, and your acrimonious history with the deceased paint a vivid portrait of motive. You claimed to walk and think on the evening in question, yet your gloves and sour expression were noted by several witnesses. Tell me, what were you thinking?" Trench's jaw tightened. "I came to confront Bletchley about those memoirs, yes, but I left him alive. I did not kill the man. Yet you were seen entering the village in a cab, gloves on, just before sunset, and you departed by the same means some hours later. The missing spool from the dictaphone, the device that recorded Bletchley's final words, was taken during this time. Convenient, don't you think?" "Circumstantial," Trench growled. Whimsy smiled thinly. "Indeed. Now, Miss Elphinstone, formally, Isabel Croft, you admitted to entering the study twice that night. Your motive was clear, to prevent the publication of a chapter that could ruin you. But your hesitation, your panicked delay in calling the police, casts a shadow of doubt over your innocence." She met his gaze steadily. "I loved him once," she said softly, "but that love turned bitter. I wanted him to stop. I did not want him dead." "And yet," Whimsy said, "someone else shares your fear." He turned to Reverend Timms, who shifted uneasily. "You spoke with Mr. Alfred Flagg, the gardener, who overheard a heated exchange between Miss Collingwood and a gloved stranger. On the Monday evening, this stranger, tall, thin, and foreign in accent, fled shortly afterward. He remains unidentified." The vicar swallowed. "We have no trace of him." Whimsy nodded. "Not yet, but there is one more thing." He moved to the hearth and picked up a bundle of ashes from the burnt letter, the final attempt to destroy evidence. The letter warned that the past must remain buried and trusted no one. A threat from Miss Collingwood, no doubt. At this, a faint noise came from the hallway. The door creaked and the figure of a man stepped into the room, a man slender, gloved, with eyes cold as winter ice. "Surprise, gentlemen and ladies," he said softly. "It seems my invitation was long. Overdue." The room froze. Whimsy's eyes glittered. "Welcome, Mr. Evans. Or shall I say it's Herr Vogel?" The man smiled thinly. "Both are accurate." He removed his gloves, revealing slender fingers marked with faint scars. "I came to prevent the publication of certain truths. Mr. Bletchley had no idea what he was meddling with." Trench stood, face pale. "Who are you?" "A man with a vested interest in silence, a man wronged by history." Whimsy gestured to the others. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the man behind the curtain, the gloved stranger, the keeper of secrets." Herr Vogel's smile faded. "I killed Bletchley, poisoned his whiskey, but I did not act alone." Gasps filled the room. "Miss Collingwood was my accomplice. We feared exposure, of past deeds that could destroy us both." Miss Elphinstone's lips trembled. "I wanted the truth to remain buried." "Yet truth, like a weed, finds the light," Whimsy said quietly. "And now the past is unearthed." Herr Vogel glanced around. "You have no proof." "Ah, but," Whimsy said, "we have your confession. Your gloves, stained faintly with cyanide residue, your hurried departure recorded by witnesses and police logs, your attempt to destroy Miss Collingwood's letter, and the missing spool from the dictaphone found hidden in your luggage." The man's shoulders sagged. "It seems the game is up." Whimsy turned to the assembled company. "Justice," he said, "has a way of finding its players even in the quietest of villages." As the police led Herr Vogel away, Whimsy lit a final cigarette and offered a wry smile. "To the final draft," he murmured, "and its unfortunate author." The atmosphere in the village hall, hastily converted into a makeshift holding room, was thick with tension. Herr Vogel, once a shadowy enigma lurking behind whispers and unanswered questions, now sat stripped of mystery, his hands cuffed and eyes hollowed by the weight of his own confession. Beside him, Miss Elphinstone bore the stoicism of one who has weathered countless storms, yet beneath the veneer lay the tremulous pulse of a woman shattered by years of secrets. Lord Peter Wimsey stood by the window, hands folded behind his back, the familiar light of intellectual satisfaction flickering in his eyes. Yet beneath that flicker lay something quieter, a trace of melancholy that clung to the evening like the heavy fog outside. Sergeant Wodge shuffled nervously. "He admits to the poison, my lord, but claims Miss Elphinstone forced him into it." Wimsey smiled thinly. The dance of blame, a favourite step in such morbid ballets. He approached Herr Vogel, who lifted his gaze with an expression part defiance, part resignation. "Tell me, Herr Vogel, did you believe that poisoning Mr. Bletchley would erase your past, or were you simply desperate?" "I was protecting what little remained of my life," Vogel said quietly. "Bletchley had uncovered things better left buried, such as war crimes, betrayals, names of those who should have been punished but were instead protected." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling upon them like dust on forgotten books. Miss Elphinstone's voice cut through the gloom. "I did not force him. I begged. I pleaded. But the past has a grip all its own." Wimsey nodded. "And so did fear. Fear that drove you both to desperate acts." He turned back to Vogel. "But tell me, why the elaborate staging? The uneven curtains, the tampered clocks, the stolen tape." "To confuse," Vogel replied. "To buy time, to hide the truth beneath layers of distraction. And the missing spool? Destroyed almost. Only Bunter's keen eye preserved." Wimsey smiled at his man, who stood nearby with the modest pride of one who has saved a day not with violence, but vigilance. "Now the question remains, why poison? Why such a slow, calculated method?" "Because words kill," Vogel said grimly. "But a quick death is too neat. I wanted Bletchley to understand his end was the result of the stories he told." Sergeant Wodge shook his head. "That's madness." "No," Wimsey corrected softly. "It is the logic of obsession. A man undone not by chance, but by the very secrets he sought to reveal." The room's air seemed to thicken further, the invisible weight of past sins pressing on all present. Vogel's gaze dropped. "I feared the memoir would unleash chaos. It would have destroyed families, reputations, perhaps even nations. And yet," said Wimsey, "the truth was already out there, in whispers, in rumours. You merely forced its hand." Miss Elphinstone spoke again, voice steadier now. "I tried to stop him from publishing, but I never wished him dead." Wimsey regarded her thoughtfully. "And yet you chose concealment over confession. That is a choice as heavy as any." A long silence followed. Then Vogel spoke one last time. "We all have our masks, Lord Wimsey. Some are worn to hide shame, others to shield guilt, but none can be worn forever." As the police led him away, his shoulders stooped under the burden. Of truth, Wimsey felt the final threads of the case unwind in his mind. He turned to the assembled group. Justice, like truth, is rarely simple, but it arrives eventually. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing a pale moon, casting silver light on the damp streets of Mimblesham. Wimsey lit a cigarette and offered a final dry observation. "The past may be a closed book, but its footnotes can be deadly." With a nod to Bunter, he stepped into the night, leaving behind the village that had hosted secrets darker than its quaint facade suggested. The morning after the arrest dawned over, Mimblesham on Wye with a chill in the air that hinted at lingering secrets yet to be fully exorcised. The village, awash with the subdued murmur of gossip and the occasional clatter of hurried footsteps, wore the uneasy mask of normalcy that so often follows disruption. At the Fox and Feather, Lord Peter Wimsey and his ever-faithful valet Bunter sat over their breakfast, the usual clink of cutlery punctuating the silence between sips of strong tea. Wimsey stirred his cup slowly, eyes distant but amused. "One wonders," he mused, whether the publication of a scandalous memoir is more dangerous than the attempt to suppress it by less literary means. Bunter, polishing a silver spoon with meticulous care, glanced up. "Dangerous, my lord, but infinitely more entertaining for the rest of us." Whimsy allowed a rare smile to flicker. "Indeed. Though I confess I prefer my murders unaccompanied by such theatrical performances. Vogels and Collingwoods, secrets and curses, it all becomes quite exhausting." Outside, the village began to stir. Shopkeepers preparing their windows, postmen, rattling letters, and children scurrying past with the carefree abandon of youth unaware of the shadows that had fallen. The constable, Sergeant Wodge, arrived to return a forgotten notebook. He approached Whimsy sheepishly, evidently hoping for praise. "Well done, Lord Whimsy," he admitted. "You've brought clarity where there was confusion. I dare say I never understood the importance of curtains, clocks, and carpets until this case." Whimsy gave a theatrical bow. "Ah, Sergeant, crime is as much about the little things as the grand gestures. The devil, after all, dances in the details." The vicar, Reverend Timms, appeared next, bearing a modest parcel wrapped in brown paper. "A gift for you, Lord Whimsy, from the parish." Curious, Whimsy unwrapped it to reveal an ancient volume of Cicero's letters, worn but lovingly preserved. "A reminder," the vicar said with a smile, "that even in the darkest of times, reason and rhetoric must prevail." Whimsy accepted the gift with a nod. "Thank you, Reverend. Cicero would have appreciated the irony." Later, as the day wore on, Whimsy strolled through the village one last time, reflecting on the intricate dance of human frailty and ambition that had culminated in the death of Cyril Bletchley. He paused at the edge of the river, watching the slow drift of fallen leaves and the lazy ripples that betrayed no hint of past turmoil. "People," he said to Bunter, "are rather like rivers. They appear calm on the surface, but beneath, currents swirl unseen, dangerous, unpredictable, and sometimes deadly." Bunter, ever practical, replied, "Good thing you're better at reading currents than most." Whimsy chuckled softly. "One must try, Bunter, especially when one's recreation involves unraveling knots rather than tying them." As they turned toward the waiting car, Whimsy cast one last glance at the village, a faint glint of dry amusement in his eyes. "I suppose in the end it all comes down to one thing. No matter how carefully you draft your final chapter, there's always an editor waiting with a red pen." He paused, inhaling deeply. Shakespeare said, "All the world's a stage." Well, I'd say it's also a library, and some volumes are better left unread. With that, Lord Peter Whimsy tipped his hat, and together they departed Mimblesham-on-Wye, leaving behind a village forever marked by secrets unveiled and the quiet triumph of intellect over intrigue. The morning after the arrest dawned over Mimblesham-on-Wye with a chill in the air that hinted at lingering secrets yet to be fully exorcised. The village, awash with the subdued murmur of gossip and the occasional clatter of hurried footsteps, wore the uneasy mask of normalcy that so often follows disruption. At the Fox and Feather, Lord Peter Whimsy and his ever-faithful valet Bunter sat over their breakfast, the usual clink of cutlery punctuating the silence between sips of strong tea. Whimsy stirred his cup slowly, eyes distant but amused. "One wonders," he mused, "whether the publication of a scandalous memoir is more dangerous than the attempt to suppress it by less literary means." Bunter, polishing a silver spoon with meticulous care, glanced up. "Dangerous, my lord, but infinitely more entertaining for the rest of us." Whimsy allowed a rare smile to flicker. "Indeed. Though I confess I prefer my murders unaccompanied by such theatrical performances. Vogels and Collingwoods, secrets and curses, it all becomes quite exhausting." Outside, the village began to stir, shopkeepers preparing their windows, postmen, rattling letters, and children scurrying past with the carefree abandon of youth unaware of the shadows that had fallen. The constable, Sergeant Wodge, arrived to return a forgotten notebook. He approached Whimsy sheepishly, evidently hoping for praise. "Well done, Lord Whimsy," he admitted. "You've brought clarity where there was confusion. I dare say I never understood the importance of curtains, clocks, and carpets until this case." Whimsy gave a theatrical bow. "Ah, Sergeant, crime is as much about the little things as the grand gestures. The devil, after all, dances in the details." The vicar, Reverend Timms, appeared next, bearing a modest parcel wrapped in brown paper. "A gift for you, Lord Wimsey, from the parish." Curious, Wimsey unwrapped it to reveal an ancient volume of Cicero's letters, worn but lovingly preserved. "A reminder," the vicar said with a smile, "that even in the darkest of times, reason and rhetoric must prevail." Wimsey accepted the gift with a nod. "Thank you, Reverend. Cicero would have appreciated the irony." Later, as the day wore on, Wimsey strolled through the village one last time, reflecting on the intricate dance of human frailty and ambition that had culminated in the death of Cyril Bletchley. He paused at the edge of the river, watching the slow drift of fallen leaves and the lazy ripples that betrayed no hint of past turmoil. "People," he said to Bunter, "are rather like rivers. They appear calm on the surface, but beneath, currents swirl unseen, dangerous, unpredictable, and sometimes deadly." Bunter, ever practical, replied, "Good thing you're better at reading currents than most." Wimsey chuckled softly. "One must try, Bunter, especially when one's recreation involves unraveling knots rather than tying them." As they turned toward the waiting car, Wimsey cast one last glance at the village, a faint glint of dry amusement in his eyes. "I suppose in the end it all comes down to one thing. No matter how carefully you draft your final chapter, there's always an editor waiting with a red pen." He paused, inhaling deeply. Shakespeare said, "All the world's a stage." Well, I'd say it's also a library, and some volumes are better left unread. With that, Lord Peter Wimsey tipped his hat, and together they departed Mimblesham-on-Wye, leaving behind a village forever marked by secrets unveiled and the quiet triumph of intellect over intrigue.